Hello again and welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your civilized yet provocative antidote to the screaming talking heads that dominate political debate. I'm Matt Miller, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, speaking for the Political Center while also moderating our provocative crew here on Left, Right, and Center. Joining me on the left side of the spectrum from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Southern California today is Robert Scheer. On the right from Washington, as always, is Tony Blankley, columnist for the Washington Times and Senior Visiting Fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
There's always the first tragedy, which is what we're going through, followed by the tragedy of overreaction. But let me suggest that whatever Congress does, and the idea of having the clowns and crooks in Washington micromanaging the American economy ought to frighten everybody, but maybe not this afternoon. The pension funds, which are the drivers of so much of what goes on with the asset managers, the investment bankers, has to get 8 to 10% return on their investment in order to be able to fund the beneficiaries of the pensions. So there's an important need for creative, productive financial services. They're not parasites. They are what make our prosperity possible. And you better be careful in everybody's ideological enthusiasm and moralizing that we don't end up killing the goose that has been giving us prosperity for an awfully long time now.
Getting the balance right between the role of government and the role of private markets is essential if we're going to actually harness the power of capitalism to serve public purposes, which is what the whole purpose of the society is. It's not like society is at the service of a market economy. It's society, through all of us collectively in a democracy, who try and set the ground rules for how markets should work so they serve all of us. And I think that's gotten totally out of whack. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Any sense, as you look at the players, Paulson, Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, is this going to cause a searing reassessment? Are there new heroes to point to yet? Any sense of how are you viewing all this?
Take Tony's view. Once they go work into government, they become crooks and clowns, or clowns and crooks. So when Paulson was head of Goldman Sachs, he wasn't a clown or a crook, but now then he goes into government. I guess he becomes a clown or crook, or certainly has a strong pull in that direction. And I think that what's happened, it is ideological. We have been subjected to a very shrill and clear ideological call, and started with Reagan, which is that, keep government away from business. In fact, I would remind people here what a disaster it would be if our Social Security had in any significant way been privatized, and people were now seeing their Social Security retirement funds crash when the market crashes. There'd be absolute panic. So there was this ideology, on the part of the Republicans that, just keep government out of it. Chris Cox, who's head of the SEC, certainly campaigned on that when he was a congressman. He certainly acted that way when he was in Congress. And what has happened is, and it was interesting to use Tony's language, because here you have somebody like Phil Gramm. Okay, he's the one that more than anyone else engineered the big round of deregulation with, as I say, McCain's support. So I assume, was he a crook and a clown then? Then he goes off to be an officer at UBS, one of the banks that's up to their eyeballs in it. Was his wife Wendy, who when she worked in the first British administration, was she a crook or clown? But then when she went to work for Enron and was on their audit board, when they took advantage of a loophole that Phil Gramm had put into the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, then she becomes a non-crook. So I do think there is a big problem in corporate influence over government. There I will agree with Tony. I have my suspicions of government because the average person is not well represented in our federal government. That's true. The bank spent $300 million to get that reversal of the law preventing banks and stockbrokers and insurance companies from merging. And they were successful, and they have their way in Congress. So it does alarm me. But I would point out, by the way, you say Bank of America now picked up Merrill Lynch at a song. Well, Bank of America before that legislation wouldn't have been able to pick them up. There was a wall between the two. And in the old days, when you went into a Bank of America and somebody gave you a 30-year loan, they made sure the appraisal on the property was accurate. They made sure you could pay for the loan. They didn't give you a sucker low interest rate because they were not going to sell that loan right away, and they were not going to get AIG to cover them. And that's what happened, and that's how we got into this mess. It was not an act of God. It was an act of man.
Well, I do think, Tony, I'd be curious about your view of some of the players and how you assess them. But I feel lucky, for one, that Ben Bernanke, who's the Fed chairman, seemed to have spent his whole academic career studying how to avoid the Great Depression or the mistakes that were made from inaction. You see Obama coming out ahead somehow from this?
Oh, of course. If the Democrats don't win this election, it means our system is broken. For God's sake, the Republicans have taken us into the toilet here. And what does an election mean if you don't throw the rascals out? I just don't get it. For McCain to have an ad now calling for regulation of Wall Street was when he was one of the key guys in Congress ending that regulation is, it's obscene. It's a total distortion. And by the way, I don't know why Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are made the whipping boys here. The definition of a subprime mortgage is when they wouldn't carry. They actually had some standards. The problem is with the respected banks and stockbrokers and insurance companies, they're the ones that took it down with these derivatives, credit swaps, all of which, by the way, were illegal before Phil Gramm got that Commodities Futures Monetization Act passed. It was illegal. Now it's legal. Lehman Brothers they tricked their own computer to violate regulation, and we couldn't see into it.
Yes. We have reached that time. By the way, just on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, though, they participated in the same huge over-leveraging of 30 or 40 to 1 of their equity, which was done to enrich the executives, knowing that if asset values went down at all, the whole thing would be dumped on the taxpayer. That's part of it. We have reached our time once again for our famed end of show, left, right, and center rant featuring pet peeves from across the ideological spectrum. Just about 20 seconds each. Tony Blankley, it's your soapbox.
Mine will be less than 20 seconds. It's just a quote I like from Maynard Keynes, who said that markets can remain irrational longer than corporations can remain solvent, and which perfectly catches the reason why we had to have intervention this week.
Robert Scheer.
Yeah, instead of quoting Quaid, I'll quote myself back in June of 2002, in the Los Angeles Times before they fired me. And I wrote, "Corporate America is a shambles because deregulation, the mantra of our president and his party, has proved to be a license to steal." And that, unfortunately, turned out to be true.
Well, if you're concerned about other issues beyond the financial crisis and how we get through it, the next couple of years could be a tough time. As I think about the progressive agenda for healthcare reform, expanding coverage, getting to universal coverage, about education reform, a whole unfinished education agenda, especially for low-income schools. Then there's the energy and climate agenda. A lot of this may be forced to take a back burner depending on how long and how costly it is to get us out of the fallout from this awful over-leveraging and deleveraging that we're now going through. What this means is that the deficits and liabilities that the next president's going to inherit may put a lot of things that progressives want on hold. That's all the depressing thoughts we have time for today on Left, Right, and Center. Thanks, as always, to Robert Scheer and Tony Blankley.